Is it me, or has there been a hell of a lot of more anti-capitalist content on YouTube as of late? Just people who don't just make one or two videos per month against capitalism and why it needs to be overthrown, but pouncing left and right, day in, day out, week in, week out. And these aren't the worst videos ever made or anything like that, but they do leave me throughout, and especially at the end, they just do leave me saying to myself over and over again, well, no, it's nowhere near as cut and dry as you're making it out to be. And then I'm also thinking, well, they probably know this, but they're trying for the wide audience thing, cast as wide a net as possible thing, which is what we should expect in a democracy, because democracies are not about quality votes, it's about attaining the highest possible quantity of votes. So once again, I have to remind myself not to be surprised when I see something that oversimplifies a fairly complex topic. So I'm a few minutes into this no-compete. Non-compete. It's his username, and I've seen a couple of other things from him, and he's at the forefront of people who just insist on pouncing as much as possible on capitalism, blank slate capitalism. Probably would be very sensitive the moment you do blank slate socialism style commentary where it's just a single blob, but he's all too happy to do the same thing to the system that he dislikes. It's not different models of capitalism, it's just capitalism. So 6 minutes and 4 seconds in, nothing egregious so far, but I did watch the whole thing and I'm just rewatching it now, and the first part was okay, no real bones to pick other than framing effects, but I think the problems are gonna kick in right now, so on with the show I go. Let's see if I can hopefully maybe pose some questions. So this isn't even meant to be a combative thing, all too combative. I have some questions, and let's see if any of his supporters or maybe himself has some answers. Of course there'll be counterpoints too, but you know, sprinkled in will be some questions that I think need to be posed and that I'm kind of disgusted at the comment section. Just nothing. Just glaring questions left unanswered, unposed in the video, and every comment is a sort of ass-licky comment. Very disappointing. But then again, it ties back into that whole, it's democratic tactics. We live in a democratic society. Quality has fuck all to do with things. It's all about the quantity. Always remember that. It's all about the quantity when you're bemoaning the state of discourse.
Capitalists want us to believe that the free market benefits employees. They tell us that capitalism means having the right to choose where we work.
Very few capitalists actually believe in a free market as an deregulated market. Let's just get that straight right off the bat. It's a fringe position within the capitalist brochure. Most people believe in either a coordinated market or a regulated market, or, if you're a Keynesian, a mixed economy. And that gets into actually things that are very close to the sort of economy he wants, which is a subset of a mixed economy that is an indicatively planned economy. But even that's too much of a band-aid for his preferences. So again, just prime example, free market, what he said a second ago, right? When it's actually free market within the context of pure deregulation is a fringe position. But you're never going to get that from either his video or anyone in his comment section. They're all going to make it seem as though that's just the mainstream position. It's not.
Say this for our increased productivity.
Capitalists want us to believe that the free market benefits employees. They tell us that capitalism means having the right to choose where we work and what we do for a living. The harder we work and the better our ideas, the more success we'll have in life.
Well, the first half was right. That is the case. But the second half about working harder and smarter, equaling success, that is horseshit. And even that, I would think, is a sort of fringe pep talk. I don't think that's a sort of mainstream pep talk. Not today, at least. They may have been able to get away with that decades ago, but they've had to up their game recently because, well, the stats don't bear that out. Nepotism and cronyism are deadly beasts, and they will fuck over meritocracy. But I don't think anything he suggests, I don't think he even touches on that problem, for his alternative system. So let's get into that.
But is this really true? Do we all really have freedom to choose our own paths through life under capitalism? Certainly there are very rare examples of people rising up from poverty to become billionaires. There are some Americans who grew up poor and went on to become captains of industry. According to a 2006 study, the children of poor kids only had about a 1% chance of reaching the top 5% income distribution versus the children of rich kids, who had about a 22% chance. A more recent study by the World Bank shows that American workers actually have about the same chance of escaping poverty and staying out of it as workers in India and Bangladesh. And we actually have worse chance.
Well, that's a kind of interesting comparison. Why compare America to Bangladesh and what did he say? Let me just go back here a bit.
American workers actually have about the same chance of escaping poverty and staying out of it as workers in India and Bangladesh. And we actually...
That's not a good comparison. Why don't you compare the best of the best? Or better yet, why not round up immigration and emigration statistics from some of the most oft-discussed mixed economies and market economies, things that you call insufficient at the end of the day, and juxtapose them with immigration and emigration statistics from some of the most oft-discussed planned economies. Or hell, you can even talk about some of the most unrepresented ones. Whatever you want. The rule is, generally speaking, throughout the 20th century, once all that deregulation stuff was, once we put a lid on that, and you had regulated market economies, coordinated market economies, and mixed market economies, representing capitalism, which is not synonymous with capitalism, of course. There's things within the socialist brochure that incorporate markets. A link to that. Unfortunately, that's a fringe position within the camp that he's running with. Anyway, back to the juxtaposition. You will always have the rule throughout the 20th century. You look into it, you will always see it. The rule is people heading westward, immigration-wise, not eastward. So his comparison there, America versus Bangladesh, that's just a microcosm of what's actually gone on in terms of where people felt like they needed to go in order to move on up. And it wouldn't have been a trend that's lasted as long as it's lasted if it had been, if the people who emigrated westward towards some kind of a market economy, if they had found that they were shit out of luck and they should have just gone back, right? Or if the stats were just fabrications. I'd love to see that. Someone point to that.
Have worse chances than workers here in Vietnam. Now think about that for just a second.
So now you compared it to Vietnam. So again, why not just compare the average workers and how content the average worker is in Vietnam to how content the average worker is in Germany or any of these other exemplars of modern market economies in Western Europe, typically, where they're situated. Or hell, in Canada. Right? Compare, do a survey over there asking if you could suddenly, just everything else about your social life remains the same, but you could be a worker in Canada or in Germany. And then ask the average Canadian or the average German if they could, everything else maintains the same in terms of their social life, but economically they can exist in a Vietnamese-like system. You will not get anything in the way of parity. The Vietnamese will be much more eager to emigrate westward, and, well, you fill in the rest in terms of what the Canadians and the Germans would do, or would not want to do.
He fought a war about 45 years ago, ostensibly to free the Vietnamese people, yet since the war ended...
Well, it's good that he said ostensibly, because it was a bullshit war, so thumbs up.
American wages have stagnated, while Vietnamese workers have been able to claw themselves from being bombed into the Stone Age to having a better chance of escaping poverty than American workers. So, what were we fighting for anyway? Oh yeah, freedom, that's what we were talking about. In our capital...
Yeah, it's very unique, unrepresented formulation of freedom that people, very few people worldwide take seriously. It still has some currency in America, and yeah, they've got no business trying to export it outside of America. Because even in America, there's just huge tussles about it, whether that should be the conception of freedom.
Capitalist system, it's all very, very free. Workers voluntarily trade their labor for wages. Nobody's being forced to do anything they don't want to do. I mean, it's not like the Soviet Union where workers were forced to do jobs that they really didn't want to do. But how...
Well, that's sort of an own goal you just scored, is it not? There was a planned economy, and, well, people still had to... All right, but it's not your ideal version of a planned economy. It was command control, or it was too centrally oriented. And he wants horizontal planning, which is just... actually, you know what? I'll save that for later.
Voluntary is wage labor under capitalism.
My buddy ThoughtSlime made a great video delving into this question. I'll put a link to the full video in the description, but here's an excerpt to whet your appetite.
Even if I like my job, doing it is still not voluntary, because I have to have a job or I'll be destitute. And that's fine, but if...
One can say the same thing about a whole bunch of things that living organisms don't want to do, but for which there's some sort of a payoff. Even if kids like going to school, it doesn't mean it's voluntary, because if they hadn't gone to school, odds are they'd be borderline illiterate. Maybe not today with the advent of the internet, but let's say in the 80s and 90s, right? When this was the way to make yourself literate, is by attending school. Even if I like going to the dentist, well, no, that's actually too unrealistic. No one likes going to the dentist. But you get the picture. Procrastination, we procrastinate all sorts of things that we finally give into and go. Doctor's appointments, dentist, school, skipping school. We do all this stuff, and we try our best to minimize its effects or to altogether avoid it for as long as possible. And we do that because we know it's not voluntary. There's no enthusiasm in it, but at the end of the day, we still have to do it, so we do it. That's living. Living, because of value fragility, 100 things can go right, one thing goes wrong, all those things that went right, non-factors, overridden by the one thing that went wrong. When that's the setup, and it is the setup for living, you're going to end up with people doing things involuntarily and doing things that they know overtly or in the back of their minds that they don't want to do. Cost benefits. Work is the same, and I don't see why work would be any different in your ideal co-op, but we'll get to that.
Presents a few problems, like it ruins our ability to negotiate for better conditions, more control over our work.
Ruins the ability to negotiate for better conditions. So union membership in the US has been falling since 1955. Falling steadily. Nothing to turn it around. Is that, are you gonna outsource that to the problem of propaganda? People are being propagandized out of doing the union thing? Or is it some other problem, maybe with unions per se? But collective bargaining is still possible. Now there's those right-to-work states which make that a lot more complicated, but union membership is not only falling in those states.
Place or better pay. You have to work to live. But the boss doesn't need you specifically for anything. They just need people like you. They can get rid of you if you're too difficult. Because there are a lot more.
They can get rid of you if you're being too difficult. The implication being that in his ideal alternative, being too difficult will not result in you getting rid of. Now, maybe he thinks that once we swap the system, the evil capitalism, for another system, there will be no such thing as difficult workers. Every worker will be an angel. Well, no, he can't possibly think that, so he's got to be something different. But what could that be? Maybe there will be a disagreement among the workers within a co-op as to whether a given worker, a given fellow worker, is being too difficult or too slow to learn a set of tasks that are crucial to the job, or too something, too lazy, too much of a flake, shows up late too often, and there's just a disagreement among the workers. And let's say that 60% believe that no, he has not crossed the line yet, and 40% believe that yes, this problematic worker has been too problematic too many times and has crossed the line. Well, you'll still have 40%, assuming that you need 50% and above for the decision to be the final decision. You're going to have 40% of frustrated workers. Or let's say it's not that's not the case. So it's not the case that because it's a 60% majority, the majority will be immediately satisfied with their verdict. Let's say you need something in the way of a 2/3 majority for a verdict like that. And because 40% believe that, like 40% would be a large enough percent to get rid of whoever's being too problematic. So then you'll have the 60% being dissatisfied, plus that one person who ostensibly didn't actually believe he was being too problematic, didn't believe he was being too difficult. Right? All these problems are going to remain no matter what you do to the meta system. All these problems on the ground. And let me tell you, there are such problems. I've worked in borderline co-op-like environments, and I've worked in purely for-profit environments by capitalists, run by capitalists and their executives. And these interpersonal problems, drama at the workplace, people having different sensibilities about how a given set of tasks should be done, there's all sorts of turmoil in all sorts of different environments, and all sorts of groups and individuals being dissatisfied or satisfied based on whose verdict prevails. In the profit schemes, oftentimes the final say is actually conducive to the majority. The majority view is okay with it, because oftentimes it is actually the worker who's being a fuckhead, too timid, unwilling to stay when something is being explained too quickly, pretending that he doesn't have any questions when clearly he should have questions, because clearly he's unable to perform 80% of the things that he should be able to perform by the time his training is done. You have no clue how often these issues crop up, and they're not issues with the system itself. And if you get your way, all those, well, let's get rid of him and swap him for someone else, all those solutions will have to jump through all sorts of bureaucratic hoops in order to get that going. It'll be like the worst union stereotypes on steroids. That's what these assholes want. If we take this from a second ago at all seriously, which I'll rewind, the implication is there. The implication is there. Always side with the little guy, or always be skeptical of the person who thinks the little guy is maybe being too much of a nincompoop and incompetent, or just slow to learn.
You have to work to live, but the boss doesn't need you specifically for anything. They just need people like you. They can get rid of you if you're too difficult.
And there's no such thing as a worker who is too difficult. How is that not the implication of what he just said?
Because there are a lot more people like you than there are jobs available.
In the United States, the average worker makes about $30,000 per year.
And in a co-op scheme, there'll be a lot more jobs. There'll be a lot less jobs. Let me just go back and see what he said.
Like you. They can get rid of you if you're too difficult. Because there are a lot more people like you than there are jobs available.
That will be the case no matter what system you have. How is changing the system undo that fact? Or you're just going to keep people employed for the sake of keeping them employed, even though they're superior candidates, right? They're superior candidates, but you don't want to get rid of the person who you've already employed, who is clearly being employed by a mistake, shouldn't have been employed in the first place, shouldn't have been hired, but now that we've hired him, oh, it'll be too cruel to get rid of him for the superior candidate, so let's, hey, you know what, maybe we can hire that new person, and instead of firing the person we've hired by mistake, we'll just create some new bullshit make-work role for him, so that we never have to fire anyone and never be cruel. Whereas I would simply say, fire them, don't do any of this gimmick job bullshit, don't do any of this stimulus, welfare to work horseshit. People who cannot find work should not be made to suffer, should be given the bare minimums of everything they need to survive. But that's not a question of economics, that's a question for distributive justice, which none of you people touch on, because you like to blend things. Distributive justice deals with what is just. Economics, broadly speaking, deals with what is efficient. The intersection of that is optimal tax. I'll link to the optimal tax article in the description section of this video if you'd like to read more about it, right? So justice on one end, efficiency on the other end, and then taxation. So I've browsed through all that, and I think it is perfectly feasible for us to have a society where, yeah, we can fire people left and right, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that they'll fall through the cracks simply because they're not working. There is a way to have an optimal tax structure that will enable them to, for example, the luck egalitarian scheme within distributive justice, or the luck sufficientarian scheme within that.
In the United States, the average worker makes about $30,000 per year. The average worker has less than $1,000 in the bank and $6,000 in credit card debt and lives paycheck to paycheck. Now, under these conditions, if a worker...
And what percent of that is the problem with the system versus personal responsibility or irresponsibility? I mean, if the answer is 0% irresponsibility / responsibility, personal factors, 100% systemic factors, I mean, even in a feudal system, or just think of whatever, some of the most hereditary caste system, whatever it is, right, the systems wherein equality of opportunity in any manifestation just did not crop up at all. There was no such thing. Even in those systems, when you're talking about the shortcomings, we know that individual shortcomings were, there was differential individual shortcomings. So even in some of the worst systems ever devised, there were things individuals could do to not be as fucked over as the system tried to make them fucked over. So even there, you can, just as a motivational device, put emphasis on personal responsibility. It's not the whole story by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something. So if it applied to those systems in a meager sense, it sure as hell applies to people living in 21st century Western Europe or Americas. Would he pick bones with that statement? Would he really say 100%? 100%. All these things he's talking about now. Let me go back to them.
$1,000 in the bank and $6,000 in...
More people like you than there are jobs available.
In the United States, the average worker makes about $30,000 per year. The average worker has less than $1,000 in the bank and $6,000 in credit card debt and lives paycheck to paycheck. Now, under these conditions...
So let me just look up the average wedding cost, because I was reading in a book that it's astronomical, or just insane considering all these statistics, the reality of all these statistics. Oh, let's see here. The average cost of an American wedding was $35,329 in 2016, according to the most recent figures from the Knot. But as costs go up, the number of guests at weddings is going down, according to the Knot. Okay, so that's all irrelevant. So I mean, right there, at least half of my sympathy, whatever bones I can pick with the system itself, and I do have some bones to pick, namely, there is no such thing as equality of opportunity, not anything close to substantive equality of opportunity in America. There might be things in the way of formal equality of opportunity, but nepotism gets even in the way of that. Careers open to talents, which is how formal equality of opportunity is typically summarized. Careers open to talents, but the moment you have nepotistic forces of cronyism getting in the way of that, people who are taller getting hired on average more than superior candidates, at least by resume, for jobs where height has nothing to do with anything. Like all these things, lookism get in the way of even formal equality of opportunity when it comes to a huge chunk of jobs. By no means are we even close to substantive equality of opportunity. But even with all that in mind, with all these criticisms I have to make as it relates to the job market and equality of opportunity and how impoverished it is, I can still look to this statistics right here. The average wedding costing $35,329 in 2016. And I can go, half my sympathy out the window, if that is indeed the average wedding cost. The average, 50% personal responsibility. Then we'll talk about the system. Would he agree with this? I highly doubt he would.
If a worker is out of work for just 1 month, they will become financially devastated. A lot of us found this out the hard way during the financial collapse in 2008 and 2009. I sure did, and so did many of my friends and family.
Because people didn't plan ahead, because they did stuff like that, or they started families when they had no business starting families because their job positions were precarious, evidently. Like to pound brewskis at the bar way too often, and they just live these fast-paced lifestyles. as opposed to a slow-paced lifestyle, which is not only better because you can save money, but it's actually more rewarding because you learn to do the delayed gratification thing. You learn to actually find joy in things that have nothing to do with expenses and commodities and non-necessities of all sorts. But none of that will be discussed here, even though this slow versus fast-paced lifestyle thing is huge. It might be bigger than the systemic issues. Because I do know people who, in the US, never had anything in the way of a promotion or a fancy job, made very little money, but because they were accustomed to slow-paced lifestyle and finding gratification in things that are just maybe intellectually rewarding, yeah, they were able to slide by the worst of the worst when it comes to the crash in 2008, and in between jobs they managed because of their savings. So that needs a place in this discussion. You cannot just pretend that does not need a place. I'm not saying it should be the biggest place, but when I look up the statistics like the wedding stuff, maybe it's half, maybe it's 50-50, but not by far the biggest.
Family members. I know some very talented people who were out of work for years despite sending out hundreds of resumes per month and trying desperately to get a job.
Well, there's unemployment insurance for that, so it's not like they were destitute. He's making it out as if people are destitute. Unemployment insurance could probably use some work in the US in terms of being strengthened. But again, that ties back to the issue on distributive justice I just raised a second ago. So,
job. I was running a company at the time, and not only was I struggling severely just to keep the doors open, racking up debt and cutting the salaries of my employees, but we were also throwing out stacks of resumes every week from desperate job seekers. What does out of work mean anyway? It's not like when the bank shat the bed in 2008, the world was materially changed in any way. There were still just as many office buildings, just as many factories, just as many human beings that needed to be fed and clothed and sheltered. So it wasn't the world that was out of work, it was the system, capitalism. The free market, which is supposed to give workers freedom of choice, did just the opposite. And when the powerful people at the top made bad decisions, they distributed their failures to the working class. This is possible.
they did, and they got away with it scot-free, and I believe that the reason they got away with it scot-free is because not enough people gave a fuck. It was a political failure.
Because under capitalism, the labor market will always be a buyer's market. No matter what you do, your labor is a mere...
If enough people were willing to hold those people who ended up getting bonuses, to hold their feet to the fire, you would have had things go down differently. You just didn't have the numbers, or at least there were a lot of rage, but it was just verbal rage. It was just lip service, essentially, leaving mean comments on the internet about how the crash was handled. And that's just setting aside the efficacy of the bailout, because the bailout itself, I'm agnostic on that. There's a lot of smart people who say it was necessary. I remember Modern Mystics' old videos. There's a lot of people who argue that at the end of the day, it was necessary. Be that as it may, those motherfuckers should not have gotten anything in the way of bailouts.
Bonuses.
Prison time, I think, can be argued. Prison time should have potentially been on the table.
Commodity. You see, capitalism is a machine that generates profits for its owners, and you're just a mere part in that machine, and every part is replaceable, and you will be replaced if a better and more profitable option comes along.
If a better option comes along in your alternative system, you will pass it by because the individuals who are already working in the given co-op that you're in or that you're concerned with, the set of co-ops, you'll just pass on all sorts of superior workers and all sorts of opportunities for advancements because of endless loyalty to even subpar workers. Why? Why when they don't have to work if you get distributive justice right? So I think underlying much of this confusion is the fact that there's just these people who think that there's a perfect overlap between efficiency and justice. And there's no such thing as a gulf between them at all. And I think the further we get away from old school societies, agrarian societies, and industrial societies, the more we get away from that grunt work and perhaps even intellectual forms of work, and the more we delve into the future, you'll see that just the gap between what is efficient or at least what is optimally efficient, and what a particular theory of justice prescribes, the gap between those two things will get wider and wider. And that doesn't mean that the unemployable should be made to suffer in any way, shape, or form. And that view, that they shouldn't be made to suffer or be uncomfortable, is perfectly compatible with just about any economic system, unless you want to stay true to some sort of Lockean absolutism, which has had its day, let's just say.
Human resources, human capital. That's all a worker is to a business. A resource to be
What the fuck else am I supposed to be? Are we supposed to take seriously the sort of bumper stickers and slogans that pop up all over the workspaces saying that at such and such company, we're a family? It's like everyone knows it's horseshit, but they insist on plastering that crap all over the walls anyway. So what, are you saying that we should plaster that sort of stuff and take it seriously too? I'm saying we should get rid of the fucking bumper stickers. We are just there for professional reasons. And that's okay, because when you're out of work, it doesn't mean you're out on the street if you get distributive justice right. You have to fragment these issues. And it just sucks that not a single person in the comment section, a whole lot of self-satisfaction in there, whole lot of high fives, whole lot of pot shots at anyone who might even disagree with them minimally and endorse one or another version of capitalism while disagreeing with them. Very in-group, out-group driven. But not a single thing, not a single person raising, hey, you know what, actually, you're blending things that you have no business blending. Economic questions are separate from questions about distributive justice, questions about what we owe to each other. So all these things ultimately reduce to, I would say 90% of the things he's raised ultimately reduce to how we handle distributive justice, which may not end up resembling the policy at the end of the day, insofar as the optimal tax wild card says, maybe optimal justice will leave a bit too much inefficiency. Okay, then we won't have optimal justice, but we'll probably have something close to it. And if you want optimal justice, well, then you probably ought to pull the plug on life itself, because there's too many competing interests and too many things that are worthy of being, too many verdicts that cancel out a different sort of verdict that is still offers something important, but only one verdict can survive. The relationship between justice and efficiency is one such example. So maybe that's my question. Do you believe that there's full overlap between optimal efficiency and a particular theory of justice that you would say is ideal? Do you think that just blends 100 times out of 100? Or are you willing to be an adult and say, there's probably a considerable gulf between those two, given how complex things are and given how rotten human psychology is?
Assumed. Capital to be bought and sold. Even if you're a lawyer or an engineer, you're still just a part of the machine, and you're eminently replaceable. On the surface, the working poor and the comfortable middle class might seem to live...
Every time he complains about replaceability, what would he do in the alternative? Never replace anyone, or only replace certain people when they get really out of hand, but not when they get a little out of hand? Why?
In different worlds, but they do have some things in common. Both groups are basically being bought and sold for a profit. The companies who hire them stand to gain a lot more revenue than they expend in taking them on board, and most of the people in both groups will be putting in at least 40 hours per week, probably even more, sacrificing almost all of their waking hours to company profits. The laborer making minimum wage and the executive making $500,000 a year probably both wish they could spend more time with their children. They both probably have passion.
The executive probably can do it if he genuinely wished he wanted to do it. He can either request for time off, or if it's the sort of position that just does not allow for time off or a shorter work week, he can probably step down. If he's making that much money a year, and he's made that much money for a number of years, presumably he's invested that or just saved it. Right? You work for that much money annually for, what, 5 years only? I'd say you're set if you understand minimalism and the benefits of it. But the fact that so few executives do that indicates that, what, are you going to go with false consciousness to explain away their personal choices? False consciousness is not going to get you very far, because anyone can just employ that tactic. oh, those people who disagree with me, oh, right, they're just deluded. Their personal choices are the result of this, that, and the other thing, blinding them to the truth. Right. The anarcho-capitalists will tell you that you don't believe in their uniform form of liberty. It's just another way of saying false consciousness. You're suffering from false consciousness because you don't believe that the liberty they want to give you is actual liberty. What other than false consciousness explains why they rationalize to themselves that you hate liberty? Same thing by a different name. Quit being a fucking stereotype.
And desires that are unfulfilled because they spend so much time at work. In this sense, all workers really are being exploited by capitalism no matter how much they're being paid. But there are some key differences between workers which are fundamental to the functioning of capitalism. To begin with, these highly paid...
I just hate people who speak on behalf of large groups but don't care that some non-trivial, sizable percentage of those groups they're speaking on behalf of would disagree with how they summarize why they make the choices they make. And you know, especially in America, huge chunk of the people who are working, whether with their hands or their mind, will say, no, I'm not going to be summarized that way. I'm not the victim of this, that, and the other.
Executives are compensated so generously precisely because they're instrumental in the administration of the exploitation of lesser paid workers. Marx called these highly paid managers and supervisors the petty bourgeois, or the small capitalists. These executives don't directly own the means of production, but they do keep the machinery of exploitation running by enforcing the will of the capitalists who benefit the most from the system. And they're arguably more vital for the functioning of capitalism than the capitalists themselves, since they act as enforcers and they're well rewarded for designing systems that extract as much value as possible.
And you'll have that sooner or later. A decade or two after your ideal is implemented, things will get divided in that way as well. You can't just pass the buck on to it. Can't just be a different executive every week or some sort of a multiplicity of executives to the point where it's just too damn nebulous altogether when you have too many fingerprints on a single button.
Possible from the labor of lower-ranking employees. It doesn't matter if we're talking about global corporations or a small business with a handful of employees, the mechanics are the same. The most successful capitalists utilize systems that squeeze as much value from employees as possible in order to maximize profits. Even quote-unquote perks like ping-pong tables at the office and free snacks are only provided to keep workers at work longer.
It's just so stupid. If the workers are taking a break from the work, why does it matter whether they end up, their day at work is longer overall? Say that they clocked out much earlier but played ping pong 0 times, or made use of these other perks 0 times. So let's say they started at 9, clocked out at 3, and then stayed in the building playing ping pong from 3 to 7. So they still spent 10 hours at work from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. But the problem he's having is, they're working and playing, and thus their day is 10 hours long. So the play is not really play because it just happens in between work. But what the fuck does it matter if it happens in between work or if they clock out when they otherwise would have clocked out and then they just have their playtime after and stay in the building? It's such a stupid point. How they aggregate their own work-play breakdown time is irrelevant.
The truth is that businesses under capitalism will only ever do anything for profits. They have to, because if you...
I wish my fucking building had a ping pong table and those things Google has. I wouldn't feel it's a strike against me at all, even though it probably would result in me spending more time in that building and clocking out later. But I just explained why clocking out later doesn't matter when you spend much larger time of your day doing that. Fucking around.
As a business owner don't put profits ahead of everything else, including your employees and the environment, then another more ruthless capitalist will come along and destroy you. So let's get back to freedom. Here's an average...
Employees are the environment. So you mentioned the environment. I'll probably link to... I'll link to the specific section where I actually linked to it in my last post on this. The idea that capitalism is inherently tied to growthism, and the steady state is the only way you can have a steady state economy is if you go with some sort of an anti-capitalist economy. The extent to which the Eastern Bloc did not cater to any sort of environmental friendliness, well documented, and check the underbar for at least some of Stalin's most egregious violations of ecological concerns, let's just say.
Worker working 40 hours per week for just enough money to scrape by, under constant pressure from petty bourgeois managers to work even harder, even though wages demonstrably do not increase with increased productivity. They can't quit their job and risk losing a month of work, and since they spend most of their waking lives at work, they have very little time or energy to search for other opportunities.
It's one-sided. I'm sure there's certain people, certain workplaces that do put this boot on you non-stop, but the fact is, so many people that I argue with online, at one point or another you find out that, well, they're actually in the middle of their shift and stuff like that. And I do see a lot of people they did a study, I'll try to look it up and put it in the low bar, but they did a study of just how often people are on their phones during their jobs. And the number was something close to 50%. I'll try to look up that study and include it here. So yeah, people aren't sweat. It's not the fucking Industrial Revolution. Quit making it seem as though the average worker is having it as bad as they were having it a century ago. Get with the fucking times. There's a lot of slacking going on. I'd say mostly with office work, but it probably reaches beyond office work as well.
Is this really freedom, though? Is this kind of arrangement between a worker and their employer really voluntary?
In 2002, Saddam Hussein was elected the leader of Iraq.
Is it purely voluntary? Jesus. How often do we do things that are purely voluntary when it comes to all these other examples? I fucking loathe every single morning back when I was a minor and had to go to school. Every single morning waking up and going to that damn place. Am I glad I did it? Well, you know what? There's probably a lot of people who would say that they skipped too much and they regret having done so. Me, even though, especially the last 2 years of high school, I skipped a hell of a lot. In retrospect, and even back then I was thinking, maybe these adults who are telling me I shouldn't be skipping this much, maybe they have a point. They are older than me. They do know more than me. Looking back, I should have skipped more. It was useless. Once you learned the basics, everything else you needed to learn, you can learn elsewhere. I should have skipped more. It was involuntary, and I did it. Does that mean the whole damn system needs to be torn asunder, the school system? Because there are cases like me who actually go through it and then go, I should have actually not gone through nearly as much as I did. I should have probably doubled the amount of classes I skipped. Well, no, because there's other people who wish something polar opposite than that. They wish they had taken it more seriously. You have something like that when it comes to this work topic. Yes, it's involuntary for all, but the extent of which the involuntariness bothers people varies from worker to worker, from individual to individual. And you got to take that seriously, because you got to take people's economic beliefs seriously. The reason America pulled a dick move by doing the coup thing in Chile is because the majority of people in that country did not mind Allende. Right? They did not respect those majority economic beliefs in that country when they did that 1973 coup. Favorite go-to example of the freedom not actually respecting the beliefs in the name of freedom. Insane, but people rationalize it. And you're opening the door for something along those same lines to be rationalized in the name of economic universalism, in opposition to the sort of economic accommodationism I would like to argue for.
With 100% of the votes. In 2014, Kim Jong-un was elected to the Supreme People's Assembly of North Korea with 100% of the votes. We tend to laugh at these kinds of news stories because they demonstrate that such regimes are democratic in name only. Clearly, these elections were only held to provide a flimsy illusion of freedom to prop up an autocratic regime. In the book...
I agree. Golf clap to you. So he's going to now analogize this to the problem of the lack of co-ops. And I'm just going to point out here. So how many cooperatives are there in the U.S.? Currently, there are over 300 worker-owned cooperatives in the U.S. operating at a diverse range of industries. While the majority are small businesses with fewer than 50 workers, there are also notable larger enterprises. So that's where this analogy crumbles. I'll just pause myself there for a brief moment to point out that the figure I just gave is actually wrong. Turns out a National Cooperative Business Association identifies over 29,000 cooperative businesses, employing more than 2 million people and accounting for over $650 billion in annual revenue in America in the 21st century. So I said 300 and, well, far short of the mark. And that'll teach me to do on-the-fly searches when I'm mid-rant. No more on-the-fly searches in the middle of a response video, especially. Very bad idea, because I just gave out a wrong figure, which I will repeat after this clip is done, because I'll just go back to what I was going on about before, but I just felt the need to clarify that. So every time you hear me say 300, the right figure is actually over 29,000, which actually just flatters my argument. It just strengthens my case that there is nothing preventing the average worker from coordinating in the way that those 29,000 cooperative businesses have gotten workers to coordinate on their own accord. But you'll hear me make that case. I just wanted to clarify that. So just remember, every time I say 300, right number is actually over 29,000. Apologies for the mistake. I'm never going to do on-the-fly searches for statistics mid-rant. Very bad idea. On I go. People can do that. They can up that 300 count to 600, 900, 9,000, 90,000 if they saved just enough money individually and pulled that money together after getting over these coordination problems and collective action problems that people who want cooperatives are notorious for. Hence, the role of the capitalist. There's no law against any of this. It's just the fact that they can't get their shit together, and maybe if they can get their shit together, the amount of money they've all saved up is like a nickel. And so yeah, if you have 100 people who are coordinating quite well, but they've all saved a nickel because they've started families and pounded one too many brewskis when they didn't need to do so, or had fucking $35,000 weddings, well then yeah, maybe even if they coordinate, they were a little too sloppy prior to their coordination to be able to save enough to jumpstart something. And that's no fucking grounds to bar people who want to be their own bosses and try their hand at that sort of entrepreneurial scheme. That is not a fucking excuse to do so. At least not in a country where the majority believes that yes, any random individual should be given a right to try and be their own boss. And if they fail, they fucking fail. What kind of option set are we willing to reduce? That's the question. The option set of what the majority believes they have a right to do, or the option set of what the minority believes. In America, your position is the minority. Huge minority. And the choices of the workers who are very lethargic when it comes to this organization and starting of co-ops, conjoined starting of co-ops, that speaks volumes on that.
Inventing the future, a distinction is drawn between these kinds of illusionary freedoms and synthetic freedoms. According to the authors, most societies only offer rights and freedoms in an illusionary way. We have the rights on paper, but in practice, it's almost impossible to exercise most of them.
It's not illusionary in the sense that 300 worker-owned cooperatives already exist. Your analogy to Kim Jong-il and the rest of the crew falls flat because of this. Those are the people who had their shit straight and got it off the ground. The fact that most people don't, it's all about personal flaws. Or they simply don't give a shit about it in the first place. And you're talking as if you're speaking on behalf of their interests. Their interests are fucking clocking out and watching Netflix. That's what they believe their interests are. You haven't convinced them yet. Once you start convincing them, then talk this illusory freedom shit.
So while a worker might have the freedom in theory to work wherever they choose, in reality, most of us are forced to choose between the binary of working at some job we really don't want to do for meager pay and just enough to scrape by, or not working at all and starving and being homeless.
Right, starving and being homeless if you totally ignore my points about distributive justice, and if you ignore my point about the 300 worker co-ops that do exist in the US, a number you can easily bump up if people simply gave a shit about it or had the ability to save enough money, which they do but they're too fucking gluttonous, and they can't fucking put a cork in it.
Not much of a choice.
There is a simple solution
Fucking world's smallest violin, as far as I'm concerned.
to this problem, isn't there? If you're not afraid of a little hard work, you could just roll up your sleeves and become a capitalist yourself.
After all, everyone has the right to start a business, don't they? There's nothing stopping you from hanging up your shingle, coming up with a great idea, and raking up some sweet
Yeah, the odds are you'll fail if you go at it yourself. You will not be your own boss for long. If you do succeed temporarily, you'll be priced out by the whatever conglomerate that chooses to corner your market sooner or later. But if you do it together, well, these have had lasting power, these 300 worker-owned cooperatives. So there is something to be said. But don't blame capitalism for that for the fact that that hasn't blown up yet. You can't do that. That's an oversimplification. It's not capitalism's fault, it's a coordination problem and a collective action problem.
profits for yourself.
Except, no. It turns out the average cost to start a business in the USA is about $30,000, which just so happens to be the amount of money that an average worker takes home in an entire year. Now, I've owned a few businesses myself in the past, and just the costs of legal fees, licenses, making sure a workplace is up to fire and safety codes, and other such expenses quickly add up to thousands.
Yeah, they can all be downgraded 100-fold, 200-fold if you simply found enough people to do it with. But I guess earlier you wanted to be your own boss and not have a bunch of other co-bosses.
And thousands of dollars. For the vast majority of workers, the right to start and own a business is an illusionary freedom. We just don't have the capital to be capitalists.
As long as the means of production are owned by a ruling capitalist class instead of those of us who do the actual work of production, the situation can never change. See, as technology advances, the stuff we need to be happy gets more complicated. A few hundred years ago, all we really needed to survive was food, clothing, shelter, stuff like that. But now, we need
You didn't need clothing to survive, not unless it was horrible winters.
electricity, we need internet, we need access to modern...
You don't need internet to survive. You might say you need internet to thrive if you are intellectually inclined.
medicine, we need... But now, we need electricity, we need internet, we need access to modern medicine, we need entertainment, and so much more. Just as we...
Well, you needed access to the best medicine back in the day too to survive. That's why the death rate was higher, right? The lack of medicine back in the day was as much of a problem for surviving than it is today.
We used to struggle against nature to maintain our lives. We struggle today to maintain the quality of life. Fortunately, as our needs get more complicated, our means of production become more efficient.
Now, as an aside, capitalists will always try desperately to take credit for these kinds of technological advances, but technology will always advance under any economic system.
The Industrial Revolution in the United States took...
Fuck. Alright, well, I gotta run. There's a task that I've just realized I'm running late on. I'll try to wrap this up hopefully sometime later today when I get back, or tomorrow, or hopefully I don't procrastinate at all. But we'll see. Okay, let's do a bit more of this crap. I shouldn't, but what the hell.
The Industrial Revolution in the United States took place at a time when slavery was still an accepted practice. Should slavery then be given any credit for these advances simply because they took place in a society that held slaves?
Well, in terms of a purely causal explanation, yes, slaves helped. But when you phrase it as in should it be given any credit, well, that sort of glamorizes slavery. It makes it sound as if someone who would say that would be glamorizing slavery. So no, we shouldn't be glamorizing any of that stuff. And we need to keep these topics fragmented. But yeah, it was somewhat efficient, though even that's disputed how efficient it was. But I think to deny any level of efficiency is to be insane.
The USSR was the first society to put a satellite in orbit and a human being in space, but capitalists are loath to give communism any credit for those advances.
Because it could have happened even if they had had something other than the economy they had. Let's say they had a mixed economy where profits, just like they did eventually implement from 1965 onwards, like they implemented these minimalistic profit here and there type schemes in certain corners of the economy. So if they had done that in 1935 and moved it forward, as opposed to 1965, they could have still put a man in space first. Nothing about this has to cancel out the other projects, right? All forms of mixed economies, like public-private partnership style mixed economy, you could have still had the first man in space. Hell, you might have even had it sooner. So you didn't need to credit communism for that, because it could have manifested in some other way. There was an agenda. The agenda can manifest irrespective of the meta-ism that you're going to call your system.
Humans will always advance technology. The real question is who controls the fruits of these labors and who does not? And the answer to that question relies entirely on who controls the means of production.
It's an interplay between economics and politics. And to suggest that it's entirely about who owns the means of production, which itself is not a simple answer, just ignores everything within the political sphere.
It's very much in the interest of the capitalist class to convince us that without capitalism, human progress would grind to a halt. As Kropotkin put it, political economy has always...
Why are you quoting someone who's... you know what, I'll let him do the quote.
...confined itself to stating facts occurring in society and justifying them in the interest of the dominant class. Thus, it is in favor of the division of labor created by industry. Having found it profitable to capitalists, it has set it up as a principle. Under capitalism, it's the capitalist class and the petty bourgeoisie who benefit the most from this technological development.
So the petty bourgeoisie in that era, he just quoted from Kropotkin, in that era, the petty bourgeoisie was the what, 1%, 2% of the population? Nowadays, that mid-ground, or whatever you want to refer to it as, right, it's not just the executive and so forth. You actually have a lot of the small business owner type who maybe employs a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen people at most, and busts his ass left and right. Very stressful. So would he lump that into the worker pile, or would he lump it into the petty bourgeoisie file? Just because there's like a dozen people who are also employed by that, right? This worker/owner division is nowhere near as clear in terms of the percentages of the population. It's nowhere near as clear as it used to be from the guy he just quoted from. And that's something to take seriously. And I don't think any of these people take it seriously when they pose their question, do we want an economy that works for the many or that works for the few? Well, the few, from the premises that they are starting from centuries back, are not as few as they are today. So the competing interests are a lot more difficult to resolve. So that's why I'm saying they can't continue being stuck in the past and quoting from these people, and they just... I'm almost tempted to just ban all these old books because they just do so much damage in terms of framing effects. The framing effects of the past have almost fuck all to do with what kind of framing effects we should have today. And of course I'm being hyperbolic, I wouldn't ban any books, I'm just saying that I think the conversations would go a lot well if these people weren't so influenced and weren't so stuck on this old literature.
Even though this development relies completely on the labor of millions of workers all around the world who...
It doesn't rely completely on it. It relies less on it with each passing decade. This is why technological unemployment and how we deal with it is the actual solution, not the band-aid solution that you're going to refer to it as, or something in the way of halfway measures. Right? Getting intellectual property patents to work in favor of the masses, if you want to go back to that framework, right? Getting it to be favorable to the masses, irrespective of who invents the next ultra labor-saving device. Having the fruits of that distributed sensibly, right? That doesn't do anything about the meta system. It doesn't challenge the meta system in the slightest. It's an object-level issue. Yet another object-level issue that directly deals with many of the gripes that he's complaining about. But he's going to refer to it as a halfway measure because he's going to bug up his ass about the meta system, right? If we just swap capitalism for another ism, then all the object level issues will sort themselves out. And we're not going to have to make difficult trade-offs. No, we're still going to have to make difficult trade-offs irrespective of the system you're working in, the grand system. And you're just giving people a distorted lens of the issues themselves. because you think the system somehow directly implicates all these object level issues, and it's nowhere near that simple.
Toil for meager existence. To quote Kropotkin once again, millions of human beings have labored to create this civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Other millions scattered throughout the globe labor to maintain it.
In his era, they did. In this era, it's about the next big invention. Swapping all that grunt work. So what are you going to do about that? Oh, right, the point I made a second ago. It's not a halfway measure, it's the direct solution to the gripes you're making.
Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins.
As long as we allow capitalism to reign,
Which model of capitalism? In Japan, they can't even determine whether it's a coordinated market form of capitalism or an uncoordinated market form of capitalism, right? This is how complex this gets. People who do this for a living can't even agree among each other what kind of an economy Japan is. You see one thing said in one economic paper and another thing said in another economic paper.
As long as we work day in and day out to serve a privileged class, our society will remain stagnant. Capitalists will always place themselves before the vast majority of humanity and benefit from advances in technology far more and earlier than the working poor who make that wealth possible.
And what percent of that is a failure on the part of the working poor for not being nearly as politically motivated? Because ultimately, legislation can fix that, right? But very few people, in my experience, and in many other people's experiences who are sort of constituted the way I'm constituted, many of them have struggled to maintain the attention level of the average person within their vicinity when they raise these issues. And these aren't even cognitively demanding issues. Can you imagine how much worse it gets when you get into the actual nitty-gritty of what it takes to run a system in the sort of way you'd love to see the system run, horizontally? So you can't even get from A to B to Z, let alone to the X to the Y to the Z, and maintain people's attention. Anytime you introduce any form of, you try to rile people up, you try to get something in the way of political will on a mass level, well, what do? You get blank stares as they notice that, well, you're not exactly dangling a diploma at the end of the tunnel, and you're asking them to think, and most people only want to think when there's some sort of direct payoff for it. And this is no promise of a payoff, because we could lose, even if we rile up a lot of people. So, it's a gamble. Which is actually stupid, because the same goes for their precious educations, where they are willing to incorporate their intelligence on a sort of demanding level. Because even if you get the diploma, well, it all hinges on what kind of a diploma you got, and you can still be underemployed at best.
Capitalists want to maintain a survival of the fittest society, despite the fact that we are all...
It's just a lie. It's just a lie to frame this in terms of survival of the fittest. To believe that any individual should have the right to try their hand at individual entrepreneurship. That also has to come with the baggage of believing that we should have a blood, tooth, and claw style economy at the same time. Because again, he just insists that the safety net is a halfway measure, but then he turns around and pretends that even though these people want the safety net, which is, I mean, what else? What other than a safety net prevents against survival of the fittest? What can prevent against that more? Nothing. So he calls it a halfway measure, demeans that belief, but then turns around and pretends, oh, that belief doesn't even exist when it comes to the people who disagree with the particular meta system I want. Anyone who's not an anti-capitalist through and through on a universal level has to believe in a survival of the fittest. And it just ignores everything, not only in between, but even on the end. Because you can even believe in a deregulated market economy, or at least a deregulated labor market, but also believe in high taxation and thus a strong safety net. There's all sorts of things that, for some reason, I don't want to speculate too much, but he doesn't seem like a dumb guy, so I'm sure he knows, but he's just willing to oversimplify, because oversimplifications work. And that's why I have to stay off YouTube, because the oversimplifications are getting worse and worse, and they're not being called out on massive levels. And so anytime I log in, I just go fucking apeshit. And then fatalistically, I think doing a response will do something. It never does anything. He's got to know that this is an oversimplification. It's sound bites. Just the sort of sound bites we see on CNN and Fox, you're now seeing it on YouTube. If you think YouTube's giving you something else, you're sorely mistaken. The only time it'll give you something else is if the view count is in the dozens or hundreds, or rarely, maybe even in the thousands. The moment it broaches 10,000, tens of thousands, then forget hundreds of thousands. It'll just be sound bites all over. And no one's going to get meticulous. Because they want to frame heroes and villains. Like, heroes and villains have to be the backdrop. And for that to truly work, you have to treat the villain camp as a blob.
As a species, quite fit to survive. As a worker, your labor is worth...
There's plenty of people who are not, in and of themselves, fit to survive, aka self-sufficient. Weren't you just complaining about that a second ago?
2.5 times what it was in the early 1970s, and yet your wages stagnate while the wealth gap explodes.
Well, there's another way to frame that, and that's from the standpoint of what you can purchase now for what amount of work time versus back in 1981. And I forget the exact figure, but I'll throw it in the corner so you can see it yourself. I forgot where I got it, but yeah, I was browsing some of that stuff. There's plenty of products that you can buy for much cheaper. And the only problem with that is they're more often than not just luxury goods. The essentials, stuff like housing, stuff like education, that has skyrocketed. So there's much ground for evening those kinds of things out, but that's not any of his complaints that he phrased a second ago. That's not what he's complaining about.
Have to demand a better system than capitalism, one in which we all benefit.
Which model of capitalism? Right, so there's... the problem with this is he portrays... You'd think, if you listen to him talk long enough, you get the impression that any model of anti-capitalism, and it's a huge list of things, many of which there's only pseudo-unique, they're really just the same, but they call themselves something different when it's more or less the same. But you listen to him talk long enough, you get the sense that he views every last model of anti-capitalism as superior to every last model of capitalism. And that's just so fucking disingenuous, because it would take a miracle for that to be the case. Because I'm sure that if you ask him, he'd be more than happy to rank order these better and worse manifestations of anti-capitalism, right? But then, by implication, one would also think that it's also fair to rank order better and worse manifestations of capitalism. And the moment you do that, you'll start seeing that, well, at least some non-trivial percent of anti-capitalist economic systems are inferior to some non-trivial percent of capitalistic systems. And what better way to reveal oneself as an ideologue than to deny that? And you don't even have to deny it on objective grounds. Just think of purely what is more desirable relative to the type of people living in some nation. Right? So nations where individuals are much more, just on a purely dispositional level, much more competitive than they are cooperative, well then, at least in those nations, can you not concede that certain models of capitalism, some non-trivial percent of them, are better for those people than certain models of capitalism or anti-capitalism are? Can you not grant that much? Would love to see how he'd deal with that question.
From scientific advances. A shorter workday is a start, and a good one, but the only practical solution is to use the principles of science and reason to harness the means of production to benefit all of humanity, not just one ruling capitalist class.
Shorter work days. So he talks about this stuff, and he doesn't even pose the question in terms of it being a trade-off between higher purchase power and more leisure time. So what percent of people value more leisure time over higher purchase power? Well, that's an interesting question. It seems that the younger generations sure as hell are opting for more leisure time than they're opting for higher purchase power. whether that's by declining promotions that would lead to more stressful work, or simply by doing the part-time thing as opposed to the full-time thing. So this message that he wants to send out is being sent out. But again, it does come with a drawback, and that is you can't buy as much junk as you'd like to buy, or as you maybe are being convinced that you have to buy. But no grand change to the system has to be made. We just have to understand that we're working within the confines of trade-offs. Each individual is. No system's going to change that. Not in the foreseeable future, anyway.
Marx puts it, freedom can only consist in human society rationally regulating their interchange with nature and bringing it under the common control instead of being ruled by it. By now,
and that's a particular spin on freedom. There's many other people who tell you that the only way you can have freedom is by securing Lockean rights in some sort of an absolutist sense. Lockean property rights. So what, are we going to argue about this? We're going to argue about different formulations of freedom? Or are we going to argue about stuff that's on the ground? I think it's more urgent right now to talk about stuff that's on the ground, and we'll leave the freedom debate. Actually, I am kind of a pluralist when it comes to what is and isn't freedom. I think what one believes is essential.
By now, most pro-capitalists are probably screaming at me through their screen, capitalism isn't perfect.
They're just kind of venting, not screaming, but maybe close enough, I don't know.
But it's a lot better than communism. If you hate capitalism so much, then why don't you move to a communist country? Well, I did. 5 years ago, I moved here, to Vietnam. And while it's true that
no one stopped you from doing it, so that sort of somewhat undermines your argument that this has something to do with freedom. And yeah, insofar as the U.S. has this ugly track record of doing coups in these countries that have, broadly speaking, rejected many capitalist tenets, yeah, there's not as many options for people to move now as there would have been had U.S. just minded its own business. U.S. did great things for Europe post-World War II, but they did fuck over Central and South America and parts of the East in the name of, well, economic universalism, which I've written against, and which now I can just incorporate in my critique against you as well, because you want your own polar opposite version of economic universalism that they wanted. Whereas I'm saying we need economic accommodationism.
things are a lot better here for workers than they are in the U.S. It's definitely not a communist country. I mean, it's ruled by a communist party, and they have sickles and hammers everywhere, but the workers don't actually own the means.
So just, I mean, little poll here of people watching this video. Would you rather live, let's say we all agree that, I don't know, Germany is the best, has the best version of capitalism. So do you think it's better to be a worker in Germany or a worker in anti-capitalist Vietnam? Just a poll there. Where would you like to see yourself working in? Right. So this will answer my question about the best versions of capitalism being superior to the worst versions of anti-capitalism. If you answer the question in the way that I'm predicting, you'll answer the question.
Of production in most cases. In fact, one of the biggest companies in the world is a Vietnamese company called Vingroup. They sell clothes, they sell cars, they sell real estate, they have department stores and convenience stores. And they're all owned by this guy, Pham Nhat Vuong, a billionaire who has direct control over the vast holdings of Vingroup and, by extension, over 40,000 employees. Now, don't get me wrong, I dig the socialist price controls they have here in Vietnam and other programs that benefit workers.
Why would you want to dig price controls on luxury goods? Because he didn't specify between all these different types of goods that we maybe can argue compellingly for price controls on, and just random stuff that is just, I don't know, some sort of gadget that should probably never have been invented because there's absolutely no real purpose for it other than trivialities. Like, why should we have price controls on that too?
And I know that the workers here have a relatively higher quality of life than American workers, as evidenced by Vietnam's very high position in the World Happiness Index and the USA's relatively low position. I'd much rather be poor here in Vietnam than back in the States. But this kind of communism, where an authoritarian state and corporate interests have arbitrary power over the masses, is not the kind of communism I advocate.
Yeah, it's because they are authoritarian and not because the masses simply haven't challenged it because they'd rather do something along the lines of fiddling with that gadget, because that's what makes them happier. Yet another day, that's a separate day that I'm devoting to this one response. I don't think I've ever done one video cropped up into so many different days, but things keep coming up. But that's actually good, because I've had a chance to do some additional research on the stuff that he's using as his sources. I noticed one of his sources for the Vietnam ranking 5th out of 140 nations in happiness, whereas US, as he said, ranks 108th out of 140 nations being measured, and having something to do ostensibly with happiness. So I actually went to check out this Happy Planet Index, and when you go to the criticism section of it, it says, much criticism of the index has been due to commentators incorrectly understanding it to be a measure of personal happiness, when it is in fact a measure of the happiness of the planet. In other words, it is a measure of the ecological efficiency of supporting well-being. Aside from that, criticism has focused on the following. Number one, the World Values Surveys covers only a minority of the world's nations and is only carried out once every 5 years. As a result, much of the data of the index must come from other sources or is estimated using regressions. 2. The subjective measures of well-being are suspect. 3. The ecological footprint is controversial and a much criticized concept. The index has been criticized for weighing the carbon footprint too heavily, to the point that the US would have had to be universally happy and would have had to have a life expectancy of 439 years, equal to Vanuatu's score in the 2006 index. So, interesting. There's no such thing as a, I'd say, straightforward, concrete measure of happiness. Those are always suspect. But to me, this one that he's relying on ranks at the bottom or near the bottom of the list. So it just seems there's this confirmation bias all over the place to believe that Vietnam's going to rank 5th and the US is going to be over 100 spots behind it. But even if we take that into consideration, even if this were some sort of a bulletproof ranking, I would still say that the thing she's about to say here is, I'll let him go ahead.
I'd much rather be poor here in Vietnam than back in the States. But this kind of communism...
He'd much rather be poor here in Vietnam than in the States. And he had a chance to immigrate, and everything's okay now, or at least is much happier than it would have been had he stayed in the States. So he got to do what he wanted to do. He got to go to a country that resembles, in some way, the model that he's after. So, what the fuck is the problem? People can do that. People have done that, and that's earlier in my video. They usually emigrated westward, not eastward. So, pointing out that he can go to a different country is not from a universal standpoint. It doesn't do anything for him, because universally, people don't flock to the sort of economies that he wants to implement universally. The trend is the opposite trend of what he would like to see. So.
Evidenced by Vietnam's very high position in the World Happiness Index and the USA's relatively low position. I'd much rather be poor here in Vietnam than back in the States. But
good thing you got your wish come true.
But this kind of communism, where an authoritarian state and corporate interests have...
Authoritarian state, so flippant uses of authoritarianism. Not only are people unable to reach anything close to consensus on what is authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism, but after all these decades and centuries, political scientists and political theorists are nowhere near agreement on this. You ask certain people what is authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian, they'll give you a single measure, and that measure is the extent to which you are taxed or the extent to which some property norms are being respected, and that dictates more than any other factor. That will dictate it. And then you ask someone like Bill Maher, and he'll tell you the extent to which democratic institutions and norms and procedures are being respected. And the more undemocratic the institutions get, the more authoritarian the society gets. So that's the single or the most important measure. And that's just two examples that crop up off the top of my head because they're the ones that I see the most frequently. And all these different coalitions are always talking past each other and pretending to not even know that they're talking past each other. So anytime you see someone flippantly using something, pointing to something as authoritarian or anti-authoritarian, as if there's already agreement. There's no fucking agreement, and they're oversimplifying once again. How many Vietnamese are actually discontent with the fact that they don't have hands-on planning, the sort of planning that he would want to have implemented in that horizontal scheme? What's the percentage of the population that's employed and that's griping about that? I venture in the single digits.
Arbitrary power over the masses is not the kind of communism I advocate for. Not by a long shot.
You see, I'm an anarchist.
I'm an anarchist.
Anarcho-communist to be precise, and
An anarcho-communist. Why the fuck even bother with words? What you are is a localist. A purist localist. You believe that anytime governance goes beyond a municipality, that's ethically or maybe practically unwise. Ethically impermissible or practically unwise. One of those two. So that's the term you want to use for yourself. A radical localist.
that we can give workers control over their own work without a big fancy state to oversee everything.
Which workers? Where are these workers who are just waiting to have that fit the bill for them?
And I believe that we can give workers control over their own work without a big fancy state to oversee everything.
Based on what evidence? Where are the people who have demonstrated an ability to be self-managed? Where are these hordes of people who have demonstrated that the interference of the boss is what depletes their performance? And if you just left them to their own devices, they would be performing at a much more impressive level. Give me the papers on that, because I've never seen that. And in my experience, it's anything but that. The trend is once again the opposite. The moment they're left even to some semblance of self-management, they'll start slacking. So not only do they not want it as a systemic norm, but they have demonstrated an inability to handle even an iota of it, to the extent that every now and then they're left in a position to self-manage. In my own experience, but maybe you've got some papers to the contrary.
I've made a few videos about how I think anarchism might work in real life, and I'll also link to some books and other videos you might enjoy on the subject, but...
No, I won't enjoy it because it's all a false premise that you don't... It actually just takes a few minutes, less than 5 minutes, to think about it, to understand that it's nonsense. The moment there's a radical decentralism that is one of the primary political goods, everything else comes with strings attached. And you want to pretend that the everything else doesn't need to have strings attached, even though you're going to give every locality and every municipality this absolute sovereignty that no other central agency that will not even exist because you're an anarchist, right? So again, decentralization, sacred cow. Every single locality sovereign, but we're also going to want to have certain other things that are going to be universal within the global economy, even though there's no other agency that's going to oversee it. One of those things is, typically, when it comes to traditional anarchists, one of those other things is egalitarianism. But who's to say that all these other localities that you don't want to have any centralized overlooker look after, who's to say that the people are going to value egalitarianism or anything close to egalitarianism? What's to guarantee that they will in some way resemble something other than your value for decentralization? All these other things that you want to pretend are not going to have strings attached to them will, and it will vary, just as beliefs have always varied by locale. How the hell do you justify that? How do you even come close to believing that it's compatible? All these localities where people presumably have different beliefs, just as they've always had in the past, I guess he thinks that sooner or later there'll be a social revolution and people are not going to be as ideologically diverse as they've always been. And that's why no outside body will have to nudge or force each locality to abide by certain things other than the belief that all localities should be sovereign. So egalitarianism will just organically come along for the ride. All these other particular things that he believes in namely opposition to markets and planning, all those other things will organically come along for the ride, because we'll have the social revolution. And of course, in that context, I can just say that I'm an anarchist too. I can just predict that there's going to be a social revolution sooner or later that will actually result in all the people coming more or less close to sharing my values and not his. So I won't have to force anyone to ever do anything, because there'll be a social revolution. So I'm an anarchist too. Anyone can play that game.
None of this is really relevant to you at all unless you are ready to start questioning the systems we have in place today. Is an 8-hour workday...
Why would you tailor the conversation to people who need to be told that they need to start questioning the system? Oh, that's right, because this is all about lowest common denominator. It's not about seeking out the most quality opposition. It's seeking out the noobs that you can fiddle with and easily persuade.
Really a necessity, or is it just something we consent to because that's the way it's always been? Does your boss have justifiable power over you, or is the power your employer have over you arbitrary and unjust?
Well, that depends on the competence of the boss, for one, and again, consult all the things that I'm going to link to in the underbar.
Or is the power your employer have over you arbitrary and unjust?
I guess that would depend on the nature of the employer and the nature of the employer-employee contract, which varies within a single country. Within a single capitalistic country, it can vary based on how much power the federal government has, and whether all states have to be union-friendly states, or whether some states can be right-to-work states. It's a matter of legislation. It's not a matter of overarching economic analysis and what kind of economic system we have. There's something like 27 right-to-work states in America. And obviously in those states, well, yeah, your employer is going to have more of a squeeze on you, but if the workers in those states truly wanted to turn that around because they felt that it was an injustice to them, with enough political pressure on the governors and the senators for those states, representing those states, sooner or later it will be changed. The reason it doesn't get changed is because the workers are not on board with having those right-to-work laws overturned completely.
Why don't you have democracy at your workplace? Is democracy under capitalism really democracy at all?
Apples and oranges. I can pose the same question for each household. Let's say a couple has 5 kids, and we say, well, is democracy really democracy under the family system, or under any country that tolerates family systems, if you don't have democratic decision-making in the household? Well, yeah, it's still democracy in the public square when it comes to midterm elections and general elections. Yeah, it's still democracy, even though it doesn't exist in the household. This is like saying, even on the political level, when you subdivide these different types of democracies, and if you oppose direct democracy in favor of representative democracy, some people say that you don't really believe in democracy. Just stupid.
You're going to have to ask these questions for yourself, and if you're not ready to ask them, if you're not ready to question capitalism, or if you're fine with things the way they are now, well...
I'm not ready to question capitalism, Jesus. They talk about capitalism as if it's Zionism, as just this one thing. It really does sound like fucking... remind me of anti-Semites talking about Zionism.
You're in luck. Capitalism is firmly in control of most of our global institutions and shows no...
It's just the same fucking things they say about Zionism.
No signs of weakening anytime soon. If you ask yourself these questions, I mean, really consider them deeply, you might just come to the conclusion that we could come up with a better system than capitalism. Now...
And people do. For certain types of people that represent majorities that are passionately opposed to capitalism and believe passionately in something else. You get enough of those types of people together, and voila, you will sooner or later get what you want. Because if they truly are passionate about it, then there'll be civil unrest, and they'll get what they want.
Maybe you hate the communists of the 20th century, maybe that's left a bad taste in your mouth, and maybe it makes you hesitant to consider alternatives to capitalism. But remember, this is not a binary. The notion that we have to decide between communism as it existed in the 20th century and capitalism as it exists today is completely spurious. There are other alternatives you may not have considered. Now, once you're ready...
Yeah, there's all sorts of variation that you are very interested in exploring on the communist side, or at least the anti-capitalist side, but you're just way too quick to brush off all the variation within the capitalist side.